Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk. And really, I guess, using the idea of getting a whole lot of feedback here. Talking about Darth Vader is really just to use that as an opportunity to use an illusion to try and explain what I'm going to talk about. What I want to say is that I'm going to deal with data and information in a broader context. We're going to have a specific discussion about Tariffs Article 39. I include Article 39 in what I'm talking about, but I think I'm going to go broader than that. Is that my argument will be the starting point is that the key trading chip in all the intellectual property we're talking about, whether it's patents or trade secrets or all those sorts of things, is the information and data about the products, processes and services. And so when we talk about data and information, I'm talking about it in that broader context. You've got a patent, you can't use the patent, you can't work the patent unless you've got the background data and information. So it's a huge issue. And that's the evil empire I'm really talking about is that great, here's my patent, but unless you can work that patent, the patent is useful. You need the background data and information. First of all, just to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which we're meeting, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I just want to go back to the key words of the Tariffs waiver. We're lawyers, and text really matters. And the key text here is that you've got the shadow provisions. I'm going back to the original document, the 669 document, which was the original document submitted by India and South Africa. And what they decided, and these are really the key words. The first one, implement, apply, and enforce. That's what the trade waiver was going to, that's what the waiver was going to be. And it was in relation to prevention, containment, and treatment. I guess the first observation to make about that is that's incredibly broad. And we'll come back to this when I'm talking about the scope of what we'll talk about is lawful kind of activity. So really the main point when we're discussing this is to appreciate that we're talking about prevention, containment, and treatment of all the kinds of intellectual property. And it's the data about prevention, containment, and treatment, which is what I'm talking about today. So what is the Tariffs problem? We've been over this. The COVID-19 crisis response requires access to extensive relevant medical products and other technologies. There's the protective equipment, the contract tracing software, medicines and diagnostics, vaccines and treatments. So this is different to the kind of thing we were talking about when we were talking about access to HIV drugs and those sorts of things. Then we were talking about essentially chemicals. Here we're talking about a much broader array. We're talking about biologicals and the paraphernalia that goes around biologicals. So we're talking about a huge array of potential and many overlapping kinds of intellectual property. So we're talking about a much bigger scope of issues this time around than we were talking about in the early ones. And the intellectual property, as we were talking about earlier today, positive or negative, positive, it facilitates access to know-how, existing technologies, those products and processes. It supports the creation, manufacturing, dissemination of new technologies. That's, I guess, the positive side. The negative side limits access to know-how, existing technologies, raises prices for manufacturing, dissemination, and purchase of new technologies. So it's good bits and bad bits. We've talked about the context before, but I think the context really matters. And my proposition would be is that when we're talking about access to medicines or access to technologies, what we're talking about is people's lives, and what we're talking about is regulation, which can save those people's lives or make their lives better. So we're talking about when you say, I want intellectual property, the consequences if someone dies, what you're doing, really doing, as you're saying, is that we want regulation in place, and we want that regulation irrespective of the person's going to die. From my perspective, the equation here is really simple. We've got to save the person's life. So when we're looking at the Tariffs problem, what we're saying is that we've got regulation at the expense of people's lives. So it's a really, really Cartesian kind of equation here. That to me, the equation is really, really obvious. So while I accept that some people like intellectual property, the consequence of that is that people die. So I guess that's the frame I'm coming to it. I guess the point I make here is that intellectual property is only part of the economy. So when we're talking about a Tariffs waiver, lots of politics I find a bit distressing. the discussion a bit distressing because we're looking at intellectual property as if it's the the key problem. If we solve the intellectual problem, suddenly there'll be a solution to this. That's not the case at all. There are other problems: transport, tariffs, bottlenecks, development and delivery. They're the ones I just want to allude to in the next few slides. But the point I'm making here is that there are a whole range, a whole category of problems, and intellectual property is just part of it. So Trips Waiver is really just part of the problem. There are some solutions which are already available, like Trips flexibilities. We've heard some discussion about some of the Trips flexibilities, so I'll actually point out a lot of other Trips flexibilities that are there and we might be able to take advantage of, but I still don't think that's the solution to the problem. So what I want to argue is that Trips itself is the problem, and when we have talking about a waiver, what we're waiving is Trips normal, and after that we're going to go to this exceptional circumstance, and then afterwards we're going to go back to Trips. That's not a solution to the problem we're talking about. Our focus should be on Trips, not the Trips waiver. And in many circumstances, what I'd say is that the argument I want to make to you is that Trips waiver actually is a distraction from the main problem here. And I want to call on that Darth Vader analogy to justify my argument. So let's go through some of these other factors which are important or considerations. And the point I'm really just trying to show you here is that we're saying the discussion about the Trips waiver is posited as if we have a Trips waiver, then we'll have a solution to the problem. The point I will make in the next few slides is that there are a whole these other kinds of issues which are also important. Each one of themselves may not be great, but altogether they create something that's really important we have to deal with. So this is just a graph to show you this disruption to transport. Maritime transport and trade prospects have deteriorated with COVID. One of the problems you have to deal with a Trips waiver is we're going to have to get access to all the materials. There are clearly some limitations on how that's going to happen. So there's going to be a delay in how we're going to get those sort of materials, and there's all sorts of problems about getting access to those materials. So I hear what Mohammed said earlier today, is that that's not an issue. I'm not saying it's a big issue, but I'm saying it's one of the problems about how you're going to go about dealing with it. Another one is tariffs. It's a huge problem. So the analysis shows that tariffs among the 27 top vaccinating producers of vaccine products and inputs. So I guess the main point here is that lots of people have the capacity to manufacture vaccines. Lots of countries do. This is just the top 27 of them. There's about 54 countries that have credible vaccine manufacturing capacity. What this shows you of those 27 top manufacturers, 23 have at least 5 tariff choke points. Now, a tariff choke point, they're the points in the process where a single point of failure can jeopardize the entire supply chain. And that's considered where you have a tariff of greater than 5%. So you can see here the tariff rate, the weighted average is fairly low, but when you start looking at tariffs on particular products which are necessary for vaccine manufacture, you find that there are a range of these kind of choke points in place. So Kazakhstan and Belarus, they levied a tariff equivalent to 291% on ethanol, which is a key ingredient when you're talking about vaccine manufacturing. So what that means is that 291% is raising the price of ethanol in the manufacture, and price is important when you start selling products and processes. So if it was a Trips waiver and you wanted to manufacture vaccines in Kazakhstan and Belarus, you'd have to be paying that tariff on the product. So tariffs is a real problem. Even in a country like Australia, where we've got really low tariffs, really low tariffs, but we still have 6 tariff choke points. So there's 6 products that you need in vaccine manufacturing in Australia, where the tariff on that is greater than 5%. That has a consequence, an effect on the final price. So tariffs are an issue here. Then there are all these trade bottlenecks. Bottlenecks are essentially points where you have some kind of regulatory intervention, which creates some kind of limitation. Really, just make the point, cross-border movement, the vaccine regulatory approval, and the distribution of finished vaccines and immunisation supplies. There's a whole bunch of them. So these are choke points which impose restrictions and raise prices. So what I've showed you is a few examples of the kinds of restrictions. Now, each one by itself doesn't have a big effect, but overall they can have a consequence. Also, the other point I want to make, and this is really making the point, that the TRIPS waiver by itself is not the solution to this problem. This is a WTO infographic showing about the delivery and development and delivery of a vaccine. Goes through points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And I guess the point I want to mention here is that this is a complicated process. So when you're talking about delivering a vaccine, there are lots of steps in that process. Intellectual property is only at the first part, and it has flow-through consequences right through the chain into getting the vaccine to the person's arm, in addition to all those other burdens which get imposed on it. The basic point is that the TRIPS waiver itself won't provide you a solution to all these compounding problems. So where are we up to? That's a good sense of introduction. COVID responses are complex, and intellectual property is really only part of the problem. That's the main point I wanted to get to. Now I want to get to the argument. So what are the TRIPS flexibilities? There's loads of them. The objects and principles, specific kinds of exclusions, there's exceptions. We talk about compulsory licensing. I'm not a great fan of that language, compulsory licensing. TRIPS in itself has other use without authorization, and there's a range of different kinds of licensing mechanisms built in there. We've also got parallel imports. There's a really important local working requirement in there that hardly anyone takes into account. There's actually WTO decisions or compromises, the dispute between Brazil and the United States, where Brazil was actually allowed to stop the United States or the US company enforcing its patent in Brazil on the basis it wasn't working that patent in its jurisdiction. Pharmaceutical export schemes, the least developed countries. And I guess the important point here too is that because patents are national, there are a whole lot of countries around the world that have no patents over vaccines at all. So I could go to Burkina Faso and exercise those patent inventions which are patented in other jurisdictions. There's nothing stopping me making a Pfizer vaccine in Burkina Faso. There's all those other problems though. You wouldn't be able to do it, you can't do it for sure, but it's not the intellectual property that's the problem in that particular circumstance. When we talk about TRIPS flexibilities, there's a study here on TRIPS flexibilities to access the low-price generic medicines between 2001 and 2016. They identified 176 instances in 89 different countries. So what we're saying here is that TRIPS flexibilities are real and they are being applied. 40 of those, or about 23%, involve least developed countries and those transition measures. And here we're talking mostly about cancer and HIV. I guess the point here is really to show you is that TRIPS flexibilities are there, they are being taken advantage of, maybe not as much as they could be, but there is a potential solution to the problem there. But I don't think that's actually the answer. This is really, I guess, just to reinforce the point is that the TRIPS flexibilities are there. Compulsory licensing, that's the Article 31, and the 31 bis provision is being taken advantage of. Least developed countries are there, but there are a whole lot of other countries as well. So the point is that TRIPS flexibilities are there and can work, but as I say, I don't think that's the solution to this particular problem. So where are we up to? We started out showing COVID responses are complex, intellectual property is only part of the problem. We looked at those TRIPS flexibilities. We showed that the TRIPS flexibilities are being used, but there's still problems. Questions of available supply, manufacturing capacity, capacity to pay, capacity to distribute, a whole range of these different kinds of problems. So if all these other problems can be solved, then a TRIPS waiver removes the intellectual property problem. I want to make the argument to you now is that actually going for TRIPS waiver may actually end up in a worse situation than we are in now. And I want to apply some legal theory to get you there. So what's the real problem? This is where the evil empire comes in. So what we have is we have rich developed countries. They have the technology and finance. Big pharma are the institutional entity in developed countries. So we've rich countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Europe. We've set up our innovation scheme, which creates private sector pharmaceutical corporations to do the research or to do the transition from the research to commercialization. So we've actually instituted as part of our regulatory mechanism or our innovation system, Big Pharma. So we built them into our system, they're cemented into our system. The difference, the problem we have here is that we have the government, we have Big Pharma, and they're different entities, and the government doesn't necessarily control Big Pharma, and this flows through a whole range of these international kinds of agreements. So how do developed rich countries, how do they go about trying to engage the private sector to deliver on their governmental kind of commitments? We've also got the Colonial Empire Accord imposed by international and trade laws. People like me would argue this is that the Berne Convention, the Paris Convention, intellectual property world is set up in the image of the Northwestern Europeans. So we have patents, we have those forms of intellectual property because they are the image that the colonial empires or European colonial empires wanted, and they exported that around the world, and they've become the laws, and they've become the norms of our international and trade laws. TRIPS then sets the intellectual property norms, and they're set up in a way that favours Big Pharma because they're putting into effect the kind of regulatory mechanism, the kind of innovation mechanism that's favoured by the Northwestern Europeans. We have this idea that the TRIPS waiver will solve the problem and get a vaccination to everyone who wants one. And I guess the question I say to you is, will the TRIPS waiver actually solve the problem? And I want to make the argument to you here that actually we need to be cautious what we want for, and Darth Vader has the answer. So, starting on our Star Wars analogy, remember that the Empire emerged out of a republic. And here we have this classic, we talk about this in the Western legal system, we had divine law, so what God was saying, gave way to law, and the focus of our law is on order, whether it's, the police beating you up or, getting killed in a hospital. We have the law imposing a kind of order. Now, the Republic, when we were talking about Star Wars, started talking about the series films, we start out in the Republic, we end up with the Empire. When we had the Republic, they had a lawful democratic basis. So we had the Galactic Senate. It was a legislative body for the Galactic Republic. There were senators and representatives, and they were elected and appointed from the galaxy. The Senate discussed the major problems and came to decisions, including making kinds of laws. And on the picture there is Senator Jar Jar Binks. He started out as going there with a senator as an assistant, became a representative of his part of the galaxy, and ended up as a senator. Now, Jar Jar Binks' role is important here because he's the one who moved on the floor to give the powers to the Chancellor. And this is the important point. This is that you have the Republic, you have a democratic process, and they declare a state of emergency. And in declaring that state of emergency, and Senator Jar Jar Binks was the one that moved it, they gave powers to an individual. So in any particular circumstance of emergency or the crisis, using that kind of language, so they've taken the general representative powers they have and they've given them to an individual, give them extraordinary powers. So the Senate, and here we're through Senator Jar Jar Binks' proposal, they gave the power to the Chancellor. And then the Chancellor said, in order to ensure the security and continued stability of the Republic will be reorganised in the First Galactic Empire. Loud applause for a safe and secure society, thunderous applause. And you hear this all the time with a state of exception. We've got the normal, we declare the state of exception to deliver some kind of authority to then deal with the crisis and return us to normal. The Republic in that state of exception gave supreme power to the Chancellor and the new empire to bring about the normal, and in Star Wars the normal was that safe and secure society. And using the language, it's a legal theory kind of language, the Republic created lawful space for the Empire. The Chancellor's decisions then had the force of law. And remember Darth Vader's role here, he wasn't the Chancellor, he was actually just putting into effect the rules or the announcements of the Chancellor. Okay, this is just trying to account for the legal theory we're going to apply. You've got your normal circumstances, box A here, that's the law that applies in normal times. You have some kind of state of exception, some sort of crisis. What you have to do is you have to then be in a position to make kind of rules which are beyond what was the law to deal with the immediate crisis to get us back to a normal afterwards. And that's where you have so what's happening at the time is that that box B, that is lawful. It's not unlawful, it's not illegal, it's part of the law, but it's different to the normal kind of law. So you have exceptional decisions for dealing with those crisis times. That's in addition to the kinds of laws you have in place to deal with normal times. So let's apply this to the WTO. So the WTO is a representative body, bringing together representatives from all parts of the earth. There's 164 WTO members, 193 nations, states and members of the United Nations, and not all the members of the United Nations and not all the states which are recognised in the United Nations Peace Treaty as states are members of the WTO. What we do have is a different body, it's a representative body, and it's certainly a different representative body from the United Nations. WTO itself is creating a state of exception to deal with the COVID crisis. And what it's doing is invoking the state of exception within WTO. It's creating that lawful space with the Tariffs waiver. So the Tariffs Council, with that document 669, that's the India and South Africa proposal. And the question of when that becomes a decision of the Tariffs Council is actually what they're doing. So they're trying to create a state of exception and trying to deal with a particular kind of crisis. To implement and apply and enforce and trying to waive that in the case of prevention, containment, and treatment. So actually what we're doing is we're giving, in a state of exception, we're giving extraordinary powers. And my basic point I make to you is that prevention, containment, and treatment can mean just about anything to anyone. So what we're saying is that in this particular time of crisis, we're going to waive the kind of normal laws that apply, normal Tariffs laws that apply, and we're going to apply really exceptional and give the authority to decide what those are to the nation states or to people within those states. So incredibly broad kind of lawful space. So the Tariffs waiver is given the force of law, and the rigors of the Tariffs Council and the enforcement powers of the WTO agreement through advance pending its normal return. Now, I understand that they're sort of discussing that for 3 years, but there's the yearly review and those sorts of things. But the original proposition was for box of X years until the COVID crisis was declared over. But again, that leaves open that who decides when the crisis is over to return to normal. So what does this mean? And the point I want to make here is who has the technology, the know-how, the finance, and so on. So the important point here is that when you're talking about we're talking about vaccines and all the other paraphernalia that goes with the crisis, but with the responding to COVID, the knowledge, the technology, the know-how, and finance is all with the pharmaceutical companies. So essentially what we're doing is we're empowering the big pharma, we're giving them a seat at the table, and in that state of exception, we're masking the real crisis. We're saying Tariffs normal is no longer here, we're going to that exceptional circumstances, and we're allowing the big pharma to then negotiate with a seat at the table about technology transfer and finance. So we're empowering law to deliver the focus on order. We're giving that to big farmers, allowing them to order the world for the benefit of the big farm, with the assumption of going back to Tariffs normal after the case. We know from Star Wars don't go back to the circumstances that you were in to start with. Just in passing, is that I would challenge the bona fides of South Africa and India in doing this. I don't know. I realise that there's other countries, but what I'm saying to you is that South Africa had the opportunity to look after its population and do the same things that Italians and Indians did, and it didn't do it. And then in India, they stopped exporting vaccines for the COVAX. So I guess the point I made to you is that it's not as if it's just rich countries playing politics and small countries, they're all playing politics. And I think that's important to appreciate that when you talk about what are we going to get back to after the event. So the point I want to make here is state of exception, justifying the Tariffs waiver tells us that Tariffs has a problem. So there's a crisis with the current legal order. During the Tariffs waiver, the state of exception is necessary to avoid that true crisis. The Tariffs waiver creates that lawful space and empowers big pharma to establish a legal order that benefits big pharma because they have the knowledge, the know-how, the finance, and so on. They're the ones who are going to set the terms because they've got what everyone else wants. You have to negotiate with them. You're going to have to negotiate on their terms. And so they get to set the terms. So the temporary waiver will end, and then we'll take us back to Tariffs normal, which is the true crisis. So big pharma will still have the technology, the know-how, and the finance, and the benefits of their reordering the laws to benefit will be for their benefit, and the and the exception that we're trying to avoid. So TRIPS waiver will actually mask a real crisis. And the real crisis we have here is TRIPS, because TRIPS is actually standing in the way of people staying alive or being treated. So I guess my solution here is let's fix TRIPS. And finally, what would Darth Vader say? You have to bear with me here. I think Darth Vader would say, WTO, you are my father. Okay. Thanks, guys.